Yes, the robots of Westworld are there to serve you and to give you the most unique vacation experience of your life.
Westworld wasn't sold as a warning. It wasn't marketed as deep science fiction. It was pitched as a simple idea you could explain in one sentence and move on from. But behind the theme park fantasy and the Western costumes, this movie was held together by rushed decisions, studio skepticism, real injuries, experimental technology, and a production that was never supposed to matter this much. Most people remember the concept. Very few know what was actually happening behind the camera. These are 16 weird facts about Westworld, 1973, the movie that quietly did things Hollywood didn't even have names for yet.
Don't look like much here, but we have everything.
Number 16. It was shot in about 30 days. Westworld feels precise, controlled, almost clinical in how it moves from scene to scene. Behind the camera, it was anything but. The entire film was shot in roughly 1 month, an extremely compressed schedule for a science fiction movie that included action scenes, practical effects, stunt work, multiple environments, and experimental technology. There was no room for over-planning. Sets had to be reused. Coverage was minimal. If something worked once, they moved on. That schedule wasn't an artistic gamble. It was imposed by budget and studio expectations. MGM didn't see Westworld as a major release. It was treated like a contained genre experiment that needed to be finished fast before costs crept up or confidence faded. The production was built around efficiency, not perfection. Ironically, that pressure shaped the movie's identity. The stripped-down pacing, the lack of indulgent scenes, the almost mechanical forward motion. All of it comes from a shoot that didn't have time to second-guess itself. Westworld wasn't refined into its tone. It was forced into it.
What'll it be? Whiskey. What about you?
Vodka martini on the rocks with a twist of lemon. Very dry, please.
Just give him whiskey. He's new in town.
Number 15. The movie was greenlit because it was cheap. Westworld didn't get made because MGM believed in it. It got made because it didn't look dangerous on a balance sheet. The film was approved largely because its budget stayed under $1 million, an unusually low number even for early 1970s science fiction. MGM treated it as a contained genre project, something small enough to take a chance on, but not important enough to fight over creatively. That mindset shaped everything. The schedule was tight. The locations were limited. There was no expectation of spectacle or long-term cultural impact. Westworld wasn't positioned as a flagship release. It was positioned as a controlled experiment that needed to stay lean and finish fast. Ironically, that lack of confidence gave the film room to exist. Because expectations were low, the studio didn't load it with stars, expensive sets, or prestige demands. What MGM saw as a minor project became a rare case where restraint, not ambition, allowed something lasting to slip through.
Listen, are you sure he was,
Of course, you don't really think he shot anybody, do you?
Number 14. The movie was still being rewritten when filming began. Westworld didn't go into production with a locked script. Scenes were still being adjusted on the first day of shooting. Michael Crichton was rewriting material while cameras were already rolling, responding to studio notes, budget limitations, and practical constraints in real time. This wasn't polishing dialogue or tweaking jokes. It was structural problem solving under pressure. That kind of workflow was risky, especially for a first-time feature director. Changes had to be made without slowing production, without breaking continuity, and without ballooning costs. There was no safety net to stop and rethink major decisions. The result is a movie that feels unusually direct. There's very little excess, very little wandering. Westworld moves forward because it had to. The script wasn't refined through endless drafts. It was forced into shape while it was already alive. Number 13. Westworld was ordered to remove technical explanations. Early drafts of Westworld contained far more technical detail. How systems worked, how failures spread, how the park was supposedly controlled. MGM pushed back hard on that. Studio executives specifically asked Michael Crichton to strip out dense explanations, diagrams, and overt sci-fi mechanics. They didn't want audiences slowed down by terminology or long scenes of experts explaining machines. This wasn't about realism. It was about accessibility. MGM was worried that too much explanation would make the film feel cold, confusing, or niche. The instruction was simple. Keep it understandable without teaching the audience how anything actually functions. That decision shaped the movie's final form. Westworld doesn't pause to justify itself, not because the ideas weren't thought through, but because the studio didn't want them foregrounded. The result is a film that moves fast, feels strangely modern, and trusts the audience to keep up, even though that wasn't the original plan. Number 12. It gave its most famous character almost no dialogue. Yul Brynner's gunslinger is the most recognizable image in Westworld, and yet he barely speaks. Despite top billing and heavy promotion, Brynner's character has very few lines of dialogue across the entire film. This wasn't an accident of editing or a script oversight. It was a deliberate performance and direction choice meant to avoid anything that felt expressive, conversational, or human. Brynner had built a career on voice, presence, and authority. In Westworld, almost all of that was removed. What remained was posture, movement, and silence. The character communicates through physical inevitability rather than speech, which made him stand out sharply against the talkative, explanatory tone common in 1970s science fiction. The result is a lead performance defined more by absence than dialogue. Brynner dominates the film without explaining himself, reacting emotionally or justifying his presence. A choice that was unusual for the era and quietly radical for a studio release. Number 11. The movie deliberately reused Yul Brynner's iconic Western image. Yul Brynner didn't just play the gunslinger, he brought his most famous screen identity with him. The costume, the shaved head, the calm posture, and the authoritative presence were all intentionally modeled after Brynner's earlier Western roles, most famously, The Magnificent Seven. Audiences in 1973 already associated that look with control, competence, and heroic authority. Westworld leaned into that familiarity on purpose. There was no attempt to disguise or modernize the image. The production relied on recognition, knowing viewers would instinctively trust what they were seeing before questioning it. That choice wasn't nostalgia. It was practical psychology. By reusing a cultural shorthand audiences already believed in, the film avoided exposition and let a familiar figure carry meaning silently. The gunslinger didn't need an introduction. The image did the work for him. Number 10. Yul Brynner was cast because he needed the money. By the early 1970s, Yul Brynner was no longer the unstoppable box office force he'd been a decade earlier. The prestige roles were fewer, and the paychecks weren't guaranteed. Brynner accepted Westworld largely for financial reasons, not because it was a passion project or a career reinvention. The role paid modestly, even by the standards of the time, and the film itself wasn't positioned as a major studio event. That context matters. The gunslinger wasn't played by an actor trying to make a statement or chase relevance. He was played by someone doing the job, professionally, efficiently, without ornament. That practicality shows on screen. The performance is controlled, restrained, and unsentimental, exactly what the role required, even if that wasn't the original intention. Number 9. Yul Brynner was injured during filming. The production didn't just look dangerous, it actually was. During the filming of a shootout scene, a blank round struck Yul Brynner in the eye, scratching his cornea. The injury wasn't minor enough to ignore, but it also wasn't serious enough to shut production down, which meant the crew had to work around it. Scenes were adjusted, angles were changed. Brynner continued filming while his eye healed, under conditions that would likely halt a modern production entirely. There were no extended shutdowns or insurance-driven delays. It's a reminder of how exposed productions were in the early 1970s. Safety standards existed, but they weren't designed for comfort or caution. If you could keep going, you did. And Westworld kept going. Number 8. James Brolin was bitten by a real rattlesnake. Westworld was filmed largely on real locations, with real terrain and real hazards. That wasn't just a visual choice. It carried real risk. During production, James Brolin was bitten by a rattlesnake used in the film. The snake's venom had been removed beforehand as a safety precaution, but its fangs were still intact. When the animal struck, those fangs pierced Brolin's protective padding and broke the skin. The incident didn't shut the production down. Medical attention was given, adjustments were made, and filming continued. On a modern set, an accident involving a live animal would trigger investigations, insurance reviews, and long delays. In the early 1970s, especially on a fast-moving production like Westworld, the priority was keeping the schedule intact. That moment captures the reality of how the film was made. Westworld wasn't shot inside a controlled environment with layers of protection. It was made in open spaces, under pressure, with real elements that didn't always cooperate, and sometimes bit back. Number 7. Westworld reused locations to fake an entire theme park. Despite presenting multiple immersive worlds, Westworld was filmed using a very small number of real locations, repeatedly redressed and reshot to suggest a massive, complex park. Sets were repurposed, angles were reused, backgrounds were carefully limited to avoid revealing how confined the production actually was. This wasn't a stylistic choice. It was a necessity driven by budget and schedule. The illusion worked because the film rarely lingers. Scenes move quickly, environments are introduced just long enough to register, and the camera avoids wide establishing shots that would expose repetition. What looks expansive on screen is actually the result of tight framing and disciplined staging. It's a classic low-budget trick executed with unusual confidence. Westworld doesn't convince you it's large by showing you everything. It convinces you by never letting you look too closely. Number 6. The movie was influenced by real computer failure research. Before Westworld was a movie, its creator was already deeply interested in how real computer systems behaved under stress. Michael Crichton had a background in science and had studied documented cases where complex, interconnected systems failed in cascading ways, not because of one dramatic error, but because small problems spread faster than people could respond. Those real-world studies shaped how the technology in Westworld was conceived during development. The idea wasn't inspired by science fiction robots or cinematic AI rebellions. It came from observing how modern systems, once they reached a certain level of complexity, became difficult to fully understand or control. What mattered wasn't intelligence, it was interdependence. Crichton was interested in how failures multiplied when humans trusted systems they no longer completely grasped. That thinking informed the film's approach long before cameras rolled, grounding the concept in real technological anxieties rather than fantasy. Number 5. Westworld became the first feature film to use CGI. Westworld quietly crossed a line that cinema hadn't crossed before. To represent the gunslinger's point of view, the filmmakers used digital image processing, marking the first time computer-generated imagery appeared in a theatrical feature film. At the time, this wasn't called CGI. It was experimental technology borrowed from scientific and military computing environments. There was no established workflow for this kind of effect. The footage had to be digitized, processed on a mainframe computer, and then transferred back to film, a process that existed completely outside normal movie production. This wasn't a visual flourish meant to impress audiences. It was a technical solution to a creative problem. The moment passed quietly in 1973, but in hindsight, Westworld sits at the starting line of an entirely new visual language. One the film itself didn't advertise, and the industry wouldn't fully understand for years. Number 4. Westworld needed hours of computer time for seconds of footage. The digital shots in Westworld didn't just break new ground creatively, they were painfully slow to make. Each brief point-of-view sequence required hours of processing on a mainframe computer, technology normally reserved for research labs and government work. This wasn't a plugin, a workstation, or a visual effects department. It was rented computer time, booked in advance with no margin for error. The process was rigid. Film frames had to be converted into data, processed line by line, and then converted back into usable footage. If something went wrong, the time and the money were simply lost. For a low-budget film operating on a tight schedule, that made every second of digital imagery a calculated risk. What's striking in hindsight is how casually the breakthrough is presented. A process that took hours of computing power appears on screen for moments. Westworld didn't celebrate the achievement, it just used it and moved on. Number 3. The movie originally had a much more violent ending. The version of Westworld that reached theaters wasn't the version first imagined during production. Early cuts of the film included a far more explicit and mechanical ending, showing the destruction of malfunctioning robots in graphic detail. These sequences went further than what audiences ultimately saw, leaning heavily into spectacle and physical breakdown rather than restraint. Michael Crichton later acknowledged that the footage didn't work the way it was intended. Some of it looked excessive. Some of it looked unintentionally awkward. Instead of escalating tension, the violence pulled attention toward the effects themselves. Rather than double down, the decision was made to remove those elements entirely. The ending was simplified, tightened, and stripped of unnecessary imagery. What survived wasn't the most ambitious version. It was the one that stayed controlled. In a film already pushing boundaries, restraint turned out to be the stronger choice. Number 2. It was greenlit by executives who didn't fully understand it. When Westworld was approved, it wasn't because MGM executives clearly saw what the movie would become. It was approved because it seemed manageable. Several people involved later acknowledged that the film was treated as a small genre experiment, not a concept expected to leave a mark. The pitch was simple, the budget was low, and the risk appeared contained. There was no sense that the movie was doing something historically new or technically important. That lack of clarity worked in the film's favor. Because expectations were minimal, the studio didn't overdevelop it, overmarket it, or reshape it to chase trends. Westworld slipped through the system as something modest and disposable. Only later did it become obvious what had actually been approved. Not a throwaway sci-fi picture, but a film that quietly pushed technology, structure, and tone into unfamiliar territory without anyone at the top stopping to question it. Number 1. Westworld quietly features a major Star Trek figure. One of the most unexpected names in Westworld appears without fanfare. Majel Barrett, best known as Nurse Chapel on Star Trek and the iconic voice of the Enterprise computer, plays the brothel madam in the film. There's no emphasis on the casting, no wink to the audience, and no attempt to market the connection. At the time, Barrett was already deeply associated with science fiction television. especially futuristic technology and authority voices. Seeing her placed in a grounded, morally ambiguous role inside a violent adult sci-fi film was a sharp contrast to how audiences usually encountered her. It's a small detail, but a telling one. Westworld didn't treat its genre connections as something to highlight or celebrate. It simply folded them in quietly, trusting the film to stand on its own, even when a piece of sci-fi history was standing right there on screen. Westworld, 1973, didn't survive because it was protected. It survived because it was overlooked. It was rushed. It was underfunded. It was made by people solving problems as they appeared, not executing a long-term plan. And somehow that's exactly why it holds up. Most science fiction movies of the era tried to explain themselves. Westworld didn't. It just moved forward, trusting the audience to follow, and trusting that the details didn't need to be announced to matter. If you enjoy uncovering the strange production choices and quiet accidents that shaped films like this, make sure to subscribe. There are a lot more classics hiding stories just as strange, and some even stranger, than Westworld ever let on.